you go. Good morning, Dr. Buckner. How are you
Good
doing? Nice to
morning.
see you.
I'm good, good. How are you?
I'm really good. Let me apologize first because I messed up the time zones. These things, man, I can tell you always confuses me, so please accept my apologies.
Oh yeah, it's no worries.
There you go. So welcome. It's 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 always nice to get to chat directly with the people in the science field, in the research, because let's just dive right into it. I think it's so challenging in this day and age to get access to good information, and specifically when we talk about science, and in this case, exercise science, because we have influencers, we have people that maybe follow certain agendas, certain narratives, and it's great to have people like yourself that actually take the time and do the research to cast doubts on things that perhaps we assume are true, right? So I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about you, about your experience in the research field, because I know you have tons of published papers, man. So can you talk a little bit about your experience, your current interests, because you have switched, at least by the knowledge I have of your research, from strength to more hypertrophy focused, right?
Yeah, I would say some of my earlier work was maybe a little bit more strength focused, but there's kind of always been underlying interest in hypertrophy and measuring muscle growth. Um, I started, I guess, probably in 2014, 2015 is when I entered science. Started working on my PhD. And I've been director of the USF Muscle Lab at the University of South Florida since 2018. And my lab's focus is trying to understand skeletal muscle growth, trying to get a better grip on how much growth is possible over time. Try to understand what are the limits of like natural human skeletal muscle growth. And I'm really interested in volume in muscle growth, and I'm also really interested um, in helping people understand how to consume muscle growth research. I think it's really peculiar that it's normal to have an expectation for a strength adaptation. So if you read a paper, you might have an expectation how much should bench press increase over 8 to 12 weeks. But people have no expectation for how much muscle should grow over 8 weeks. Um, and maybe we can't ever provide that, but I think we can maybe get to a place where we understand it a little bit more and can have some realistic expectations.
Yeah, for sure, because for me in particular, I'm interested in I'm all about muscle growth. I'm a natural bodybuilder. I love this stuff.
Yeah.
And I've had the privilege of now talking to people like yourself. But I also had this conversation about volume hypertrophy with most recently Josh Pellant and Zach Robinson. I also talked about it with Dr. Helms, with James Krieger back in the day. So it's kind of confusing, man, because that's the first paper I wanted to ask you about. The paper it's a review article that you published most recently, the dose-response relationship, there are still doubts paper,
Yeah.
because one of the things that I found fascinating is the magnitude of growth that was possible, or at least could be possible in some of the studies in favor of the dose-response relationship. And I know you have casted some doubts on how much muscle growth is it really possible? Because some of these papers, like you mentioned in this particular publication, and most recently in the one single set study, are quite large. And sometimes when we superficially read these papers, we it goes right here, like, oh, they grew something. But how much is that really? And how impactful if that is for a lifter that cannot use ultrasound and measurements like this?
Yeah, I think I was having a conversation with someone recently, and some people view it as controversial to even ask the question, is this amount of growth possible? And how I kind of responded to them was, if we can't question it, then there's something wrong, right? And questioning a finding, right? If I read a paper and I find the growth to be extraordinary, very, very impressive, there's nothing wrong with saying that's very impressive. It doesn't invalidate the study. It doesn't mean that the findings of the study aren't real or aren't possible, but it adds a layer of skepticism and inquiry that's worth having a discussion about. And I think it's true. I think a lot of these studies, are finding 4 and 5 times the magnitude of growth of other studies. To me, that's interesting. And I want to know why that's the case. And, I actually had a conversation as well with Zach and Josh with Data Driven Strength. And, we were discussing like, are techniques so different that you just can't compare between this study and that study? No, I don't think that could be the case. I think there's still some objectivity to, you know, zero point 0.7 centimeters of muscle growth is a lot of muscle, no matter how you try to frame it. Um, but I'm optimistic that over the next several years, we're gonna work on maybe getting better standardization and maybe establishing some expectations for what muscle growth should look like in the context of research. Um, but to me, it's quite intriguing that you use the example of the recent one set paper. It's an interesting paper. It's a really cool paper. But the first thing, because I'm a muscle growth researcher, the first thing I noticed was, 0.37 centimeters of muscle growth. That's on the larger side of not just a lot of studies, but it would be on the larger size of the literature at whole, as far as the magnitude of absolute increases in muscle size. And to me, it's interesting that that's a very large magnitude of growth from a very small amount of volume. It doesn't mean it's not real, but the statement that that's interesting, I think, still holds true. And people should be fascinated by that. People should ask the question, okay, could this low volume approach, could it not only work, but could it be actually leading to very impressive amounts of muscle growth? And then from there, I think people have to decide how they want to weigh that data for themselves, because I don't want to be the appeal to authority that says this takes true or that takes true. I think it's more important just to help people see things so they can then interpret them in the way that they find helpful, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah, man, and that's really interesting because it gets even more complicated when we take social media into account. Like, for instance, when you question the magnitude of growth, for some people, it can seem like you're just a contrarian, right? Like
Yeah,
you just want to be in the opposite side of things because you want a following, which is not the case. In a scientific discussion, I think we should be capable of letting our feelings aside and just take the data and try our best to interpret the data. But that gets really hard when, let's say, you're following a specific narrative, or not in this case, but perhaps selling a specific product, which has been the case prior in other situations. But for instance, to put it into perspective, I actually took a screenshot of one of your stories. I think it was yesterday, I think it was, or the day before,
yeah,
about the one set study where you highlight the magnitude of growth, which in percentage of change, it was 0.37 in comparison with other studies that employed 24 weekly sets on comparison with 6 weekly sets, getting about 0.15 percentage change, which is quite the difference, right?
yeah.
So I'd love to hear your perspective on this, your take on this. What would be the possible explanations for this? Because one of the most common that I've heard that we actually talked about with both Josh and Zach, it's edema. It's all cell swelling,
Yeah.
but I think it's not quite satisfactory.
Yeah. So that post was kind of inspired by, you know, I'm making some of these posts to try to guide people to the fact that a lot of the scientific communication that you get from scientific communicators is very inconsistent. Um, and for example, there's been other studies where you could tell the communicators want one group to be better than the other. So they'll point out that, oh, we had double the growth in this group compared to this group. In this recent paper for some of the muscle sites, they could have made those same infographics, but they didn't because it wasn't beneficial to any narrative that anybody was pushing that you need to train to failure versus you need to train with 2 reps in reserve. But if someone wanted that, they would make the same infographics that we've all seen, right, on different topics, and range of motion is the one that comes to mind most readily. Someone could have made the infographic double the growth from going to failure versus 2 reps in reserve. And for me, I just put up that comparison because I think it's a good thought experiment, right? what yields 0.11 centimeters of growth in one study, doing far less volume, 24 to 6 sets, that's a huge differential, yields more than double the growth. Now, your question is, I think, important. Why is that? Um, I don't know, and there's so many possibilities. People have thrown around the idea that just different measurement techniques, different measurement sites, all these sorts of things. If you looked at the table I posted, both the muscle sizes were around 4 to 5 centimeters, so that they were comparable. It was like high fours versus low fives, which is a pretty common size for a quadricep muscle thickness value. Um, Me and Holly, my partner, we wrote a textbook chapter together where we talked about the average change in muscle thickness. And typically over 8 to 12 weeks, you see zero point 0.1 to 0.25 centimeters of growth. And I was working on a meta-analysis where we looked at the normative changes across time, and the average change of the entire literature is somewhere around zero point 0.2 centimeters. So this new study would rank on the high end, right? More than the normal change from a very low volume. And, some people take that to mean that low volume training is all you need. Some people will say, well, there's something wrong with that study. I don't necessarily want to be here to tell people what the correct interpretation is because I don't know. But what I do know is I'm skeptical. One of the things I always tell people is we need replication of findings. Um, and we also need control groups. So a vital piece to muscle growth research is including a control group to know, did we get 0.37 centimeters of growth because the error of our measurement is really high, or is it because the protocol was really effective? And, we have to be open to all possibilities. And I think we have to be um, consistent in how we communicate things. And, I think that's why, whether this study were to fit my bias or not, it's my responsibility to point out that, hey, if you compare this to other studies, it's just kind of interesting, and it seems not necessarily odd, but it's fascinating because it's really impressive. And I think it's important for people to know that the muscle growth in that study is really impressive to muscle growth researchers, because it adds a layer of not only does this work, but it works really well.
And you already mentioned it, but I actually have the question right here about the lack of control groups, because that could be a really co-founder about the results. And also, I think one of the most interesting parts of the recent meta regression that we alluded to is that it analyzes set volume and hypertrophy not as a categorical variable, but as a continued variable. So I think that's also important to take into account because, for instance, uh, if you agree, I'd love to dig a little bit more about how does it impact the results and the interpretation of a study when we don't have a control group to compare the results to.
Yeah, I think it really limits what you can say, right? So the examples, the current study, the one set study, all you can really say is that within that study, the failure group for some muscle sites looked to be a little bit better than the non-failure group. But you can't extrapolate outside that study because there's no comparison group. And I've told people, because a lot of people have taken that study to mean that all you need to do is one single set for 3 exercises twice a week. But in my DMs, I've told people, I said, if they included a higher volume group, maybe they would have seen more growth in the higher volume group, even though the growth is already very robust in the single set group. Um, but I do think a control group would be helpful because it would help you frame, okay, what kind of change do we need to see to be impressed? And what kind of difference do we need between groups to know that it's meaningful? And that's probably one of the reasons why there wasn't statistical significant differences between the failure in the 2RIR group, despite some of the muscle sites looking like they're pretty different, because it looks like there's probably quite a bit of variability in the change, which limits your ability to have strong conclusions about something. But I think control groups, more and more labs are starting to incorporate them. And, a lot of people, I don't think they understand the utility of having it. And the utility is understanding your measurement. It helps you know the limitations of your measurement and the the borders of how far you can go in interpreting and understanding your results.
Yeah, and also one key component are the actual measurements. You have, well, vast experience on this topic, but what, in your opinion and expertise, could be the best practices in the research lab for measuring muscle growth? Because I know perhaps the results can be a little bit different if you wait, let's say, 48 hours, 72 hours, and the specific site, and all this minutia that, again, it goes over by your heads when we just read the abstract and we see a post on Instagram or whatever it is, that twice the muscle growth, triple the muscle growth, and it gets tough because, okay, what does double the muscle growth actually mean? Is it impactful in a from a practice point of view, let's say for a bodybuilder, not in the research lab? And so many more things that I wanted to ask you, but first, I love to hear about what are the best current practices and standardization techniques, methods for actually measuring muscle growth.
Yeah, as far as standardization, I was having a discussion with another researcher actually yesterday, and we're talking for the need for more standardization because different labs are all kind of doing things a little bit differently. And in another discussion I had probably about a year ago, some people were holding the ultrasound probe perpendicular to the muscle, others were holding the probe parallel to the muscle, and that probably affects the measurement as well. Um, how long you wait before you take post measurement so you ensure that there's no swelling or edema. Typically, most studies are doing 48 to 72 hours, but maybe there needs to be stronger standardization. The current study that I'm doing, we have two post-testing time points. We have one that's 72 hours, and we wait 2 more days, and we do a second post-testing just to make sure that the initial post-testing doesn't have swelling. Now, I kind of put out in our dose response paper where we question the paper we were talking about at the beginning. In that paper, I put out the idea that swelling is playing a role. It's not because I personally believe that there's strong evidence that swelling is playing a large role in muscle hypertrophy research. It was because I was trying to come up with a reason as to why muscle would grow so much in some studies when it doesn't grow nearly as much in others. And to me, swelling was just a reasonable hypothesis. Now, the whole swelling idea, it's like kind of snowballed, and I see people talking about it all over the place. Um, where some people in the scientific community are adamantly opposed, saying it's a ridiculous idea. I've seen that. And it's like, well, it's not a ridiculous idea if growth is so impressive that it's probably not likely that that can occur in the time frame observed. It could also just be measurement error. It could be um, measuring the wrong site post-testing, right? If you move your probe just a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, you could get a different image. So you think you're imaging the same muscle in your post-testing, but maybe you're not. If you move it just a little bit up or a little bit down because of the shape of the muscle, you're measuring things differently. So yeah, maybe it's swelling, maybe it's just measurement error. And the solution for that is have a control group. And once you have a control group, your control group's going to have that error as well. And you're going to be like, oh, I guess maybe just the measurement isn't as good as I thought it was. Another thing that I've been thinking about recently, because I think maybe some of the posts I've been making, it's kind of opening people's eyes a little bit to limitations of research, like just the inconsistency of muscle growth across studies is at least a little bit concerning. And I've been talking to researchers of all different walks in the last week or so. And I think there's also probably different levels of practice for people that are trying to measure muscle growth. Um, an example I'll give: during my PhD, I measured muscle for 3 years for acute studies. So just one visit studies where you measure a muscle and then you measure swelling. It's really easy to capture that. It's much more difficult to measure muscle growth. So to measure muscle growth, you need practice, like hours and hours and hours of practice. Well, I practiced ultrasound for over 3 years before my mentor would let me measure muscle growth in a training study. And the reason for that was it took about 3 years to have a good enough measurement and good enough reliability in my measurement that I had any business trying to measure muscle growth. And I'm wondering if maybe some of the labs aren't doing that. maybe, or maybe there's just no standardization on how much practice is necessary to get to the point where you can measure muscle growth. At USF, we only have master students. So I only get to work with my students for 2 years, and then they go off for PhDs. My students don't measure muscle growth because they don't get enough practice in that 2 year period. Maybe on year 3, I'd let them start measuring muscle growth. But in my experience, you want to clock a lot of hours with that ultrasound probe to get very good at that measurement. And I'm beginning to wonder, maybe some labs are having students practice for 2, 3, 4 weeks and measuring muscle growth in studies. And I don't think you can do that. I think it takes kind of years of practice to get to the point where you have enough reliability in your measurement to measure muscle growth.
I love it because different people can have different views and different takes on the same topic, the same paper, based on their experience and where they're coming from. For you, it's
Yeah.
more like how are they measuring it? The students are they capable enough to measure correctly? But for me, for instance, it's like, oh, okay, I want to jump to the conclusions. I want to know, do I need to do more sets because I want to grow more for bodybuilding show or whatever, which it doesn't necessarily mean that this volume increases that resulted in more hypertrophy for me are actually something that directly translates to a different practice right in the gym, right? So I think for people, it's really important. But the next question I wanted to ask you is, what are the challenges that you face in different sides? Because one thing is as a researcher, as a professor, but also um, putting content out in social media and appearing in several podcasts and so on and so forth, and having discussions on social media, because that's a different beast, man. And
Mm.
people, well, people have emotions, people get sensitive, people think they're being attacked or whatever it is, which is not necessarily the case. And some other people are prone to use, let's say, contrary evidence or try to be contrarians to get a following, to have presence on social media. And that just creates this whole confusion that I think it's really unproductive and can be a little bit damaging for
Yeah.
both the science, for both the researchers, so on and so forth. Because you, as researchers, have a lot of jobs, man. And one new job that you actually have to take into account is social media. So I wanted to ask you, how did you come about it? Because I know, and I can only imagine how complex and how big of a challenge it actually is.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't ever claim to be good at social media. I'm not super active. I've been having more discussions recently. So I've been having those discussions just because um, you know, I I think what I noticed was kind of a lack of balance and perspective. And the lack of balance was like it was going only one direction. And my approach years ago, and maybe even up until about a year ago, when I would get frustrated with social media, I would just write a paper. And in my head, I'm like, a paper is a much stronger statement. It's hard to get something published. It's hard to write a paper. Um, my approach has always been, I'll just combat these things in the scientific literature. But you know what I found? I found that when I published the paper, none of the social media science influencers would even talk about it. It'd be crickets. So, and I'm interested to see the recent baseline training volume paper from D'Souza's lab. It's an excellent paper, but what you'll notice is no one's made a post on it because it doesn't agree with their bias. So the scientific communicators that are communicating muscle growth research are quite inconsistent and communicating things in a way that's just non-biased and open to all possibilities. And that's what it's about. Um, so for me, I love having conversations just because I'm really passionate about what I do. Most scientists, they don't do research to get rich. They do it because perhaps they're good at it or they enjoy it, and it's a lot of fun. And I really enjoy the process of mentoring and working with students, trying to help them develop the skills to become independent scientists. Um, but as far as navigating social media, I don't think I've figured it out yet. But what I do think is valuable is having conversations and showing people that you can have a different perspective without being emotional about it. And, I'll always share my point of view and I'll tell you why I think that, right? So I I have a perspective on this study. Maybe it's different than this other person's, but I can tell you why it's different, right? And we should be able to have a discussion about that, and no one should feel threatened about that, right? Because a difference of perspective, it doesn't hurt anybody. It's ideas, and it's the process of trying to help people think. And Wayne's that saying you guys are getting paid? Oh, mean. That's one of my former students. He's in the chat. But
That's pretty cool.
yeah, I'm stuffing my pockets, Wayne. But you know, I think for me, it's just trying to help people think through a diverse range of perspectives, and I think it's really important. And I urge the influencers, the PhD influencers, to let go of being attached to data, right? And and be open to the possibility that everyone but yourself is correct. Um, and it doesn't mean that you're not correct, but entertain different perspectives and talk to people and just be open to the possibility of being wrong. I'm open to the possibility of being wrong, and every paper I publish, I wonder, okay, what are the people that I really hold in high regard? What are they going to think? Maybe I made a mistake on this study. Maybe my interpretation is not the correct interpretation. Um, I think the nature of social media is to portray confidence and like authority, and I think that does well for people. Um, but science, I think, needs to take a much more humble stance of just curiosity and maybe saying, "Oh, this study points in this direction, so it's possible," instead of saying, "Oh, we now know this, and if you're doing this, you're missing out on that." There's so much of that in social media, and what I think is happening, or my experience of watching the kind of science content grow on social media, you think it'd be a good thing, and maybe in some cases it is, but it kind of feels like the science is becoming the industry again, like it's coming full circle. Science emerged into the industry to fix bad information, but then science just kind of became the industry and started controlling the narrative and producing their own version of information. And it's like a quick get to the top of the stack of folks that are communicating. I have a PhD, therefore I'm more important, so I should be listened to above and beyond all of the people. So I think in a lot of ways, there's a new iteration of communicators that are using PhDs to skip to the top of importance and the top of rank in the context of content that's being put out. And I see people all the time without PhDs that have really interesting points and really interesting takes that I think people should listen. I don't think having a PhD in and of itself is a reason to listen to somebody. I think we should listen to people when they have interesting, thoughtful, well articulated takes, and we can learn from everybody.
But I must confess two things. First, I'm being paid, sponsored by Big Coffee.
I
Well, can you imagine that? That would make me really happy.
wish I
And
was
also,
sponsored by energy drink.
that's easier, man. Maybe you can get perhaps Red Bull, perhaps what's the other one? Monster or some stuff like that. I'm sure you can work that out. I can help you with that. And also, I wouldn't mind a PhD. But in all seriousness, I think it's really valuable to have discussions about the data without any emotional attachment, which is it's easy to say it. But again, we're human beings, we're social, we're emotional, we have a psychological component that needs to be taken into account. But like for instance, for some people, selling certain product is the way they for their means of life, you know? And when you attack something that kind of shadows this, it gets hard. I do understand. But I think that's one of the big challenges for us as human beings, uh, being interested in science, to let these things on the side. And to briefly go back to the topic of volume, I don't know if you recall, but it was, I think, 2018, 17, perhaps. We had the first episode, I call it, of the Great Volume Wars between, I think it was Brad Schoenfeld, I think it was James Krieger, Lyle McDonald, so on and so forth. It kind of got ugly. People got called out. And that's the thing. that I hate to see
Yeah.
because it shadows what we actually care about, at least I care about, which is how do I better my practices for my clients, for myself, because we face, let's say, several dangers. Let's say we have these NS papers that found out that what was it, 52 sets, please correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
led to better muscle growth. Okay, so I'm as a practitioner, I'm gonna go with my recreational clients for 52 sets because this paper said so. And that's not the point. But also the point is not to be fearful of doing more volume. And that's quite a challenge to get into the middle ground and to establish, let's say, a starting point and what to take into account to increase volume, decrease volume as a means of critical thinking, not as a means, not as means, I'm sorry, of following certain narrative. So I wanted to ask you, Dr. Buckner, with all the research, not that you've done, but also that has come out in the recent years, how do you conceptualize for yourself or for your clients, not in the research lab, volume as a variable for muscle growth? Do you go by certain baseline? Do you increase it or decrease it as necessary? And also, what are your thoughts on accumulation blocks? All this stuff that in the field we it's pretty much common practice.
Yeah. Um, so I'll start by saying I don't think research can perfectly inform people's volume that they want to train at. And the reason is we don't really design research in the way that people train. You know, almost every study you read, they train 2 times a week or 3 times a week. Well, I mean, how much volume can you compress into 2 or 3 training sessions per week? And you know, some of the studies are getting a little bit better in that they'll train your quads in the lab and they'll have you train your hamstrings outside of the lab so they can, you know, it's always a logistical issue of trying to train people in a way that people would actually train, but also fit the lab schedule that you have to adhere to at a university because, you know, some people's labs are teaching class in those labs, you know, and they, you know, you might be collecting data 10 hours a day of just training people. And you have to figure out how that's logistically possible. Um, so with regards to volume, I when I did that, it was a volume roundtable that Steve did on Revive,
Okay.
and at the end of the podcast, everyone kind of gave their volume recommendations, and mine were amongst the highest in the podcast, which everyone thought was hilarious because you know I've published quite a bit critiquing the volume literature, and you know I think as you've kind of realized, my critique was more so of the absolute change values that we're seeing in some of these studies, and also the inconsistency from study to study and across studies, which really, in my opinion, hinders the ability to draw strong conclusions. So I first think of volume as when you approach an exercise, how many sets on that exercise do you need to do to maximize what you can get out of that movement, right? If you're approaching a knee extension machine, at what point are you no longer stimulating a muscle protein synthetic response and you're just delaying your recovery? And I tend to think after your third working set, somewhere in the 3 to 4 working sets, you could do additional sets, but I don't think you're getting additional value out of those sets. If we took muscle plugs and we measured the muscle protein synthetic response, it's not going to keep going up. At least I haven't seen evidence to suggest that that's the case. Um, so from on an exercise by exercise basis, I think you get the majority of the impact from your first set, and I think you kind of plateau it off by doing sets 2, 3, and you know maybe some people want to do a fourth set. I also think your effort on your sets determines if that second, third, fourth set's really important. You know, some people they thought they trained hard on their first set, but their first set, let's be real, it was a warm up set. So for that person, sets 2, 3, and 4 might be more important from the other individual. But I think with 4 sets, you have a good insurance policy that you're maximizing what you can get out of that movement. The next question is, well, how many different movements do you do for a muscle? And this is the reason that science can't answer the question because we don't necessarily design studies this way. But I tend to think 2 to 3 exercises per muscle in a given session. So if you're training quads, maybe 2 or 3 exercises that stress your quads, but that stress your quads in different ways, right? So one of the things I've told people, if more volume is a good thing, you want to get that more volume in a diversity of movements because, we know that a knee extension and a leg press hit the quads a little bit differently and grow the quads a little bit differently. So maybe you want both of those exercises um, in your program. Proximity to puking is a better predictor of effort. Wayne 2020. Um,
I'm gonna
so
steal that one, man. You're buyer beware. I have to warn you, Wayne. I'm gonna steal that one. No, please excuse me, man.
um,
It's funny.
so yeah, I don't necessarily have an answer I can give people to say this is the evidence-based approach to do this many exercises because I don't know, but I suspect two or three is something that's reasonable that people can recover from. And then the next layer is, well, how frequently should you train? And maybe the answer to that is two or three times, but the literature on frequency is kind of in its infancy. I don't think we have robust data on frequency. But twice a week, three times a week seems to be reasonable. And I, 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 I wonder beyond that, you know, Holly, who I don't know if you know Holly or not, but she competes in the IFBB. So like someone like her, she needs to train. She competes in bikini. Glutes and shoulders are a huge priority. So how with what kind of frequency can you train and expect to get more gains or more growth, more stimulus from doing that? I think there's still a lot for science to do to answer these questions. And I think in the meantime, I think people like yourself, people like Holly, who have a lot of experience, have worked with a lot of clients, I think your trial and error can fill in the dots just as much, if not more than what science can at the moment, because y'all have experience working with individuals and trying things that just logistically we have not been able to do in our labs to this point, if that makes sense.
Makes a whole lot of sense. And shout out actually to Holly. Oh, there she is. Shout outs
Yeah.
to Holly. Of course, I know her. And also shout outs to James Steele and Dr. De Souza, which I'm seeing are joining the live stream. Just as a side note, thank you for all the cool research you put out. It's greatly appreciated. Um, and yeah, I love your response because it's full of minutia and it's really paradoxical that your volume, set volume recommendations were the highest in that set volume roundtable. It's kind of funny. But in regards to the recent meta regression, the one by Zach and Josh and their colleagues, I want to ask, what is your current take on their results, and did it impact how you think about volume? Because for me, at least, it really did change the way I view volume for me and for clients, establishing that, okay, it's possible that by doing more volume to a certain degree, which is unknown, could lead to a little bit muscle growth, but it comes with a price. Let's say, obviously, the time investment. Perhaps some people can have a little bit of pain in the elbows, in the shoulders. And like they mentioned, both Zach and Josh, more volume is better until it plays against you, something like that, which I love that quote by them. Did it change your perspective? But perhaps even with all the uncertainties, even with all that we don't currently know and we're still not sure about, would you make the case for somebody to go to really high volumes, perhaps on a specialization cycle? Let's say, taking the example of Holly, which would be for delts, for glutes, or perhaps you would be a little bit more discreet and focus on other variables.
No, I'm really curious about like specialization phases, and one of my former students, Rio Kataoka, is at University of Mississippi, and one of the things um, he was looking into for his dissertation was like the competition of resources. So another layer that I wonder about in the context of this discussion is, and maybe inevitably this would have to be true, if you're doing a specialization phase, would your volume and other muscle groups have to drop off? Right? And as adaptation, how much competition for resources is going on for adaptation? If you think about the idea of trying to force a muscle to grow, right? Nothing about your physiology wants to keep growing, right? Someone like yourself who has high levels of hypertrophy, you have metabolic breaks in your muscle that are telling your muscles don't grow anymore, because energetically it's not good for survival to keep just raising the bar, right? um, so on some extent, the specialization phase, maybe the potential success of this specialization phase would be dependent on, okay, if you want to grow your glutes, you got to stop doing X, Y, and Z muscle groups because when you train your full body, you have all these muscles creating demand for resource, demand for adaptation. And I've written a lot on Hans Selye, who developed the general adaptation syndrome. And his explanation for adaptation was something he called adaptation energy. And he said all adaptation comes with a cost. And he didn't really know what to use to explain that cost, but he called it adaptation energy. Um, and maybe you could grow your glutes with a super focused high volume phase, but maybe that's going to come at the cost of other muscle groups losing a little bit, right? And one of the things I talked with Josh and Zach regarding some of the higher volumes, um, if these things are real, like we read a research study. Let's say the research study shows that this high volume group gets a lot of growth over 8 weeks. Um, how many times can you replicate that finding? Right. So I think people need to realize that exercise training studies, you're altering how you normally do things. You have hyper focused training in a lab and you get a lot of growth. And one of the things I've said, if we just use the Schoenfeld volume study where they got zero point 0.7 centimeters of quadriceps muscle growth in 8 weeks, right? If you could replicate that twice, you have a centimeter and a half more of muscle thickness. Well, I think a centimeter and a half is all you can gain throughout your whole training career. That's a lot of muscle. As far as adding thickness, that's a lot of muscle. So if you could replicate that 8 week finding, just let's say 4 times in a year, you would have Samson Dowda's quads, if you know who Samson Dowda
Yeah,
is.
for sure.
Um, so if you could literally replicate that finding 4 times, your muscle goes from this to this, and you are now a Mr. Olympia level physique. So it has to mean that a training study represents a muscle growth happening that can't be replicated in a linear fashion. Because if it were linear, I mean, we would all look pretty ridiculous if we could replicate these things in our own time. Um, so I, I I am open to the possibility of specialization phases. Maybe that's something that a lot of these researchers will start investigating and maybe look into. And there's so many good scientists that are doing really great work. Some of them, unfortunately, have been listening to me for the last few minutes. But um, I, I think that I'm optimistic that science will do a better job. But I'm also, I have a slightly different interpretation of research in general, in that if a study is amazing, it's still limited by how many times you can capture that amazing response, right, over a lifting career. And I think we've also not done a good job as a scientific community of maybe helping people understand the limitations of how you can apply this and how could this actually impact your results in your training. Um, and maybe the answer is some of these studies wouldn't really change anything. You'd continue your progress at the same um, rate that it's currently happening. Maybe you can temporarily adjust it, but I think it's difficult to do. Um, I thought that adaptation meant to be energy efficient, like doing the same activity. You just get efficient doing it. Am I wrong? Um, I'm just trying to respond to this comment here. I'm talking about it a little bit differently. It's more of an abstract concept put forth by Hans Selye, and Holly put in the comments. We covered it in our research review. Um, I think in one of our recent issues, but it's more of this idea that your your capacity to adapt is limited, right? So we have, like, I think of it as like a governor on your muscle to limit your muscle growth. Um, just because, if I could get to 300 pounds of muscle, I would probably die pretty quickly because the energetic cost, and like when you consider different metabolic theories of aging, I think it makes sense that we limit ourselves. Um, so growth, I don't think would be efficient. Growth would be inefficient from a metabolic standpoint. I don't know if that helps at all, Dr. Juan, but that's kind of how I think about adaptation.
Yeah, that was pretty insightful. And shout out to Dr. Juan. He's my friend and colleague. It's nice to see
Oh,
him
cool.
here. He was super interested in the live stream. He was excited, and well, we're both nerds about this stuff, so it's always really a privilege to directly get to talk to you, all the people in the research. And also, I'll be sure Once we uploaded, I uploaded this to Instagram, I'll be uploading it to YouTube. So I'll make sure to link the research review by Holly and yourself, which I think
Oh, cool.
it can be really helpful for people to little dig a little bit deeper. But yeah, totally, man. I think with the research, one also really interesting thing that you mentioned is that it's like we're taking a snapshot, because most studies for practical issues tend to last 8, 12 weeks. And sometimes we ignore completely that fact because hey, it's 8 to 12 weeks that you need to recruit people. You need to have people that actually train in the fashion that the study needs them to train. You actually need people to take the measurements. You actually need people to supervise the training. It's a whole endeavor, man. And we cannot say that these people are actually training this way outside of the intervention. And we can also not say that these people are going to get the same results in another bout of 8 to 12 weeks. We would need studies lasting years, and well, as you more than anybody knows, that's kind of impossible, right? So for us, I think it's important as, let's say, just science enthusiasts to at least be aware of how these things actually work.
Yeah. I've shared this on some other podcasts. My lab's been working on a year-long study,
A
which
year-long
which we
study?
finished up. Yeah,
Yeah.
we did a year-long study, which I'm excited to hopefully soon share those results. So we're kind of in the analysis and writing phase of that paper. Um, but that study, for example, I just got tenured. I've been at my job for, I think I'm on my sixth or seventh year, and I started it on year one. So that's a 6 year investment to get 1 year's worth of data. So it's not a smart use of my time, thinking about keeping my job and being productive and helping students write. Um, but it's still important. So it's a study I was able to run in the background, and I'm excited that eventually we'll get that paper out and be able to share those results.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great use. Well, I'm gonna sound selfish as all hell, man, but it's a great use of your time for us nerds that really just like to dig into these topics and continue learning. Because this current day and age, with all these setbacks in social media and narratives and people that just try to push both products, narratives, and whatever it is, to actually get access to not just the science, but to the people that are doing the science. And for me, for instance, that I get to reach out to you and you politely say yes, and we're actually live discussing these things. For me, it's mind blowing. It's one of the crazy and beautiful things for me about social media. So I'm always grateful for this opportunity and to actually expand my own particular views and hopefully help other people that are actually curious and want to learn more. Not to say that they know better, but to actually do better. So
Yeah.
just to finish off and be super respectful of your time because I already delayed this 1 hour. Please, I'm sorry for that again. I just wanted to ask you about your current takeaways, not so much in the volume side of things, in the main discussion, because you already explained a little bit how you think about it and how you do it, but how to actually navigate for the people interested information on social media, how to consume science in social media, and perhaps if people are brave enough, how to actually jump into science, because again, that's a whole different beast.
Yeah. Well, as far as navigating social media, and I see Dr. D'Souza in the comments, I recommend people check out what he's doing. Um, I, I think it's just important to follow diverse perspectives and make sure that everyone you listen to doesn't agree. Make sure everyone you listen to doesn't come from the same research lab. Because if they did, then your diversity of perspective is quite limited. I have my biases that are from my experience, right? My experiences with research, what I've done, what I've seen, and I value other people's perspective that have done things completely different than me. Um, so follow as many different people as you can, and don't discard one person just because someone says something bad about them. There's so much drama in the science space nowadays, and there's a lot of people don't know this, but there's a lot of silencing of the experts because the influencers want to be perceived as the experts. So I was muted in comment sections. Dr. D'Souza was muted in comment sections. Other scientists that I know, their comments didn't show up. So they weren't able to be part of the conversation in areas where they're experts. And I think that's so important, right? So just try to follow people that have different views and takes. And it's really difficult because the barrier to entry is becoming higher and higher because people are getting smarter and smarter in the way that they sell you things, in the way that they market things. But listen to how people talk, listen to how people engage with others. And I think an evidence-based person should always be capable of engaging in polite discussion, right? If someone is in my comment and says I'm wrong, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Why do you think that, right? And it doesn't hurt me. It's there's nothing wrong with that interaction. But if someone starts calling them names and acting sarcastic to them, right? It's probably because they're emotionally attached to whatever they're posting about, and that's a bit of a red flag for me. I wouldn't say don't listen to that person. I would say maybe be cautious with what that person says. Um, and then people that want to get into science, um, you know, find a good mentor. That was the most important thing for me, was having great mentorship. Sue Graves is my mentor at Florida Atlantic University, and Jeremy Lanicky was my mentor at University of
Cool.
Mississippi. And both wonderful people. Um, Dr. Lanicky, like he taught us to think, helped us develop our thinking skills and our ability to raise questions, but not do it for the sake of raising questions, but out of curiosity. And I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of really, really great students that it's cool to watch them go off and some of them are applying for jobs now, which is crazy to me. But yeah, look how people engage online. A lot of these scientists are online, and you want the ones that show grace. You know, it's I guess there could be times where I could go embarrass people in comment sections and be mean to people, right? But you want to show grace to people because they don't have your experiences, they don't have your perspective, they don't have your experience. So why not guide somebody and help them understand why you view things the way you do. And that's why people like Dr. D'Souza, they're great mentors. He's at University of Tampa, which I can literally see from my window right here. So look for good mentors. Email people. If there's someone you hear and they're interesting, send them an email, set up a Zoom call, go visit them at the university and see if you can learn more about what their lab does.
Man, I love that. And I have to say, shout outs to Dr. De Souza. I saw him in the comments. And also shout outs, I don't know if you're still here, but
Yeah,
Josh Pellant.
Josh.
For me, all the people that I've got the privilege to talk to, they're all mentors to me. It's like I get to challenge my own ideas. I get to actually understand some things about how the research process actually goes by. Because for me, at least in Mexico, it's not quite well, we don't have an exercise science program in said university. It's not really a thing right here. So to get access through social media to all this information and to actually put it into perspective and into practice and hopefully help other people out. To me, it's the coolest thing, man. So anyway, just to thank you again for your time. It's been really a privilege to get to talk to you. It's been super insightful. Of course, with your permission, I'll be downloading this live stream and upload it just as is to YouTube so people can watch it with subtitles. I'll be sure to tag your social media, your research gate, and the most recent papers, and also the research review that Holly linked in the comments. So without further ado, I don't know if you want to add something to the people still with us this morning. So, and also thanks for the people joining.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. And thanks to everybody that listened. And yeah, I enjoyed the discussion.
My pleasure, man. Anytime, and you're more than welcome in Mexico. So hope to see you soon.
Right on.
Take care, man.
All
See you
right,
later.
you too.